In the middle of the dry expanse of the Nevada desert, a dusty, unmarked road leads to the front gate of what is perhaps the world's most protected premises. Locked in by an electric chain link fence and a guarded gate in a rectangular area of 6 by 10 miles, this secluded area is littered with intimidating trespassing signs. One would think that America's much fantasized top secret defense base could be no more secure, but make no mistake, they are watching. The cameras see everything. Even the slightest movement is captured in an instant from every angle and recorded on the database. On a nearby hilltop, a white pickup truck with a tinted windshield peeks out at everything below. Locals believe that the base has records on every wild hare and gecko that hops the fence, while others have claimed that the approaching road is embedded with sensors. The known is finite, the unknown infinite. Intellectually, we stand on an islet in the midst of an illimitable ocean of inexplicability. Modern American history. Many myths and legends, like the Sasquatch and the Mothman, among many others, have fascinated and piqued the interest of millions of people in the USA and beyond. While many enthusiasts and self-proclaimed eyewitnesses have backed their theories and experiences with supposed proof in documents, accounts, and in some cases, photographic and video evidence, most of these have been brushed aside as urban legends and rumors. Reigning supreme among these myths and legends is the burning question of whether aliens exist and if they have visited our planet and made contact. Featured in innumerable movies, documentaries, newspaper articles, and blogs, Area 51 is also known as the extraterrestrial superhighway and is thronged by hundreds of thousands of UFO enthusiasts each year. These are speculations that galactic visitors are tucked away somewhere inside the base. At the same time, one of the more colorful rumors insists the infamous 1947 Roswell crash was a Soviet aircraft piloted by mutated little people and the wreckage remains on its grounds. Some even believe the US government filmed the 1969 moon landing in one of the base's hangars. Between all these theories, one thing is for sure. All roads lead to this cynosure of modern-day mystery where science and legend meet while scores of investigations to establish a connection between Roswell and Area 51 lay interrupted gathering dust. So what is Area 51 and why is it there in the first place? To understand the beginnings of Area 51, we must travel back to 1951, when the base served as a secret US military lab for conducting research and nuclear tests. After the Second World War, tensions between the USA and Russia had reached a fever pitch, and the American government, in an attempt to keep a check on the developments in the Eastern Hemisphere, approved the production of a new line of reconnaissance aircraft, the first of which was the Lockheed Tu-2. The CIA's Richard Bissell and Herbert Miller were both charged with locating the ideal region to test the spy plane. With its arid and mountainously jumbled landscape, the region around Lake Groom seemed ideal to both Bissell and Miller. The spot had been a dumping ground for nuclear waste for years and was miles away from the nearest town in the four directions. Only high-ranking officials with top clearance from the CIA were allowed in the area. For close to the next 4 decades, Area 51 remained hidden from the public until one day in 1989, Robert Bob Lazar, a conspiracy theorist and self-proclaimed physicist, disclosed that the CIA had hired him to reverse engineer extraterrestrial technology at a secret site called the S4 located within the base. Lazar claimed to have examined an alien craft and read US government briefings that described alien involvement in human affairs over the past 10,000 years. His claims eventually brought several Area 51 secrets to public attention, fueling conspiracy theories surrounding its classified activities, with many also rejecting his claims as baseless. But the first incident that triggered theories of UFO sightings in the USA began on the 5th of July 1946 when civilian pilot Kenneth Arnold reported spotting an unidentified flying saucer in his airspace. This was followed by some 800 similar reports until in July 1947, a farmer named Mag Brazil in Roswell, New Mexico, reported unidentified debris that had supposedly crashed into his ranch to the Roswell Army airfield. Since his ranch had no radio or telephone, he had been unaware of the UFO craze of the prior 10 days and had pushed his findings under a bush for later inspection. After the authorities visited his farm, news spread that a reconnaissance balloon had burst and landed in Brazil's backyard. However, close to 62 local eyewitnesses reported that Brazil had been blackmailed into hiding the truth. It is said that the army, along with the CIA, had found among the debris scattered in many areas of the ranch strange bodies that looked like pale children from a distance, but upon a closer look had no earthly features. In 1978, Stan Friedman, along with his research fellows, led an independent investigation into the matter, the efforts of which were published in a book titled The Roswell Incident, that elaborately mentioned the crashing of a UFO in the area and also featured interviews of many eyewitnesses. After Friedman heard that Bob Lazar had been investigating the same incident, he spoke with him and later claimed that Bob was in fact a fraud, his theories baseless, and that he wasn't even a physicist. Until then, the world had been unaware of the connection between Roswell and Area 51. An important question is raised here. If what crashed into Brazil's backyard in 1947 wasn't a UFO, then what was it? And what was the secrecy behind Area 51? In the previous episode, we traveled back in time to solve some of the riddles that led us straight to more mystery and suspense surrounding Area 51. Let us now explore the connection between Area 51 and the Roswell incident of 1947. The story of how it all started is truly exhilarating. In 1947, two pilots of the Signal Corps spotted what they described as flying saucers, which instead of flying straight like conventional aircraft, seemed to rotate while zipping past them. This was unheard of anywhere in the world before. The technology was bewildering to understand or process. Before pilot Kenneth Arnold could give chase, the craft was reported to have crashed. When the 509th Operations Group team reached the site, they found a disc resembling a saucer with a blurry hallmark engraved in Russian. Because the authorities did not want an egg on their face for failing to trace an unidentified craft sneaking past their radar into American airspace, it was reported that the craft was, in fact, a weather balloon that had crashed from a height of 60,000 feet. The fact that the Roswell area was a routine test site for nuclear weapons development only added to the government's worries. As part of the arms race that was triggered at the end of the Second World War due to the increasing distrust between the USA and Russia, both nations left no stone unturned in searching for and grooming scientists of a higher caliber than those of former Germany Chancellor Adolf Hitler, who was proven to have had an airspace technology far more advanced than the other two. Under Operations Paperclip, more than 1,600 German scientists and engineers were taken from former Nazi Germany to the US for government employment, while Russia too made similar efforts. With the discovery of the Russian engraved craft in Roswell, the Americans quickly realized that Russia had had a head start over them in the arms and technology race by harboring the Horton brothers' sibling scientists who designed advanced aircraft for Hitler himself. In a bit of sabotage Russian progress, a search for the brothers was undertaken by the European Command. More than 100 agents were smuggled into Germany, who, after spending 9 months in the country, began to send back reports of the Horton brothers having worked upon an aircraft that had no wings and could fly at speeds exceeding far beyond 1200 mph. In 1951, the CIA was in its third year when war broke out in the South China Sea, with North Korea invading the South. This led to a proxy war between the Americans, who supported the democratic South, and the Russians, who backed the communist aggressors to the North. This war became the perfect platform for the scientists on both sides to exhibit their genius by unleashing jet versus jet warfare between the American F-86 Sabres and the Russian MiG-15s. The American air offensive was led under Colonel Legon, who quickly witnessed Russian air superiority firsthand. This led him to suggest the development of spy aircraft which could fly at the ceiling of 60,000 feet, which was beyond the reach of conventional tracking radars of the time. This became the genesis of the development of the V-2 rocket, which Werner V. Braun and Ernst Steinhoff would design. But through the development phases, it was realized that the gross weight of the craft was too heavy to fly at the desired altitude given the heavy-duty surveillance equipment on board. Lehon then approached General Curtis LeMay, who had been leading Operations Crossroads, the code name for US nuclear bomb tests in Bikini Atoll. Upon hearing Lehon's idea, he rejected it as a waste of time, after which Lehon spoke with James R. Killian, the then president of MIT, and Edwin H. Land, inventor of the Polaroid camera, both of whom led the president's scientific board. They recommended that Lehon approach the CIA, which with its secret operations and missions could get easy funding for developing such advanced technology. This set the ball rolling under Project Aquatone, led by Richard Bissell, who captained the U-2 spy plane development mission and finally zeroed it on Nevada, Texas, which facilitated both a natural runway with its salt flats and a mountainous topography that ensured complete secrecy for the testing. The result was the U-2 reconnaissance plane capable of flying at 60,000 feet and was first flown by Lockheed test pilot Ray Goddy. The successful launch and testing also led to the decision to completely hand over the control of mission operations to the CIA, since it would be used for top-secret surveillance, tracking, and intelligence gathering. But this success also attracted rumor-mongering and bizarre claims. People reported spotting a shiny metallic object flying high in the sky and even started spreading the news of an intergalactic war between Earth and Mars. The CIA, in response, created a different department that kept a record of such reports being made and was quick to discredit any suspicion directed at their latest trump card. In 1960, reportage on unidentified flying objects quadrupled in numbers. After the Oxcart test flight, the area in and around Lake Groom came under the public eye, with many mistaking the CIA's Lockheed A-12, which had been developed to specifically avoid Soviet offensives during the Cold War, as a UFO given its metallic wings and high flight ceiling. With limited resources and access to information in those days, as compared to today, it was easy for one to mistake a plane for a saucer. Dear listeners, in this episode, we understood the beginnings of Area 51 and how the Roswell incident triggered the sensation for decades to come. But while America had its eyes fixed on the azure skies, did Soviet Russia too possess such superiority? Stay tuned to find out more on the next episode of Area 51. Did Area 51 play a pivotal role during the Cold War between the US and Russia? Did Russia possess equal superiority when it came to weaponizing the latest technologies of the day? In this episode, we will flip the coin to see both sides. In other words, we'll see if Russia conducted secret missions on America and their response when they discovered foul play on their soil. Since its inception, there has been intense secrecy surrounding Area 51 that has turned it into a central theme for UFO lore. Though never declared a secret base, all research and projects undertaken here are TS top secret and deal with SCI, sensitive compartmented information. It was only under the Freedom of Information Act that the CIA publicly acknowledged its existence on the 25th of June 2013. During the Cold War, the base began to be officially used to test and evaluate captured Soviet fighter aircraft. Under various programs, namely the Have Donut, Have Drill, and Have Ferry, fighter MiGs were flown in the United States to assess their performance, technical and operational capabilities, pitting the types against US fighters. Meanwhile, it is also interesting to note that the race between the US and Russia wasn't limited to supersonic technology but test bases too. Located 41 miles from Moscow, the NII-88 is an identical version of Area 51, which was also served as a secret mission base. Prior to the Communist Revolution, the NII-88 didn't figure much in the Soviet scheme of things, but after its discovery by the CIA in 1955, it was disclosed that the base was being used to develop an intercontinental ballistic missile targeted at the US. Once again, Russia seemed to have a head start over its Western counterpart. In January 1956, Times magazine published an article on Soviet missile technology as a big story and deemed it a pressing danger for the US. Following the report, it was under CIA's Curtis Lee May that Operation Home Runway was approved, whose mission was to fly reconnaissance aircraft to the North Pole and trace Soviet territory. However, the mission was short-lived as the Russians got word of American espionage and had to be aborted. With the pressing need for intelligence on fast-developing Soviet technology, it was decided that the U-2 with its high-tech surveillance equipment be utilized for the purpose. Pilot Henry Stockman proved instrumental in flying sorties into Soviet territory at high altitudes, which helped the Americans gather much-needed information on Russian developments. The Russians once again discovered the CIA's attempts, and the already embittered relations between the two superpowers was stressed to the limit, but Russia did not make the revelations public as it would be then portrayed as the loser in the espionage game. President Eisenhower ordered the CIA to abort the U-2 mission altogether. Russia, meanwhile, was on the cusp of launching its surface-to-air missile, which worried Richard Bissell. He came up with a simple plan and suggested the aircraft be lead with radar-absorbing paint, which would render Soviet trackers useless. But he was told that given the added weight of the heavy coating, the aircraft would not be able to achieve the desired altitude. But Bissell wasn't one to be easily demotivated and gathered a group of scientists who, under Operation Dragon Lady, began development on 31 modified U-2 planes, the pilots for which also began to be searched. The process was tough and pushed even well-trained pilots to the limit. In 1957, a newly painted U-2 plane flown by Robert Seeker over Groom Lake caught fire due to the paint catching on heat, resulting in his death. However, following the incident, in March of the same year, USAF pilot Anthony Tony Bevacqua completed flight training at Area 51 as the youngest pilot to ever check out and fly the modified U-2 plane. He would later retire with over 2,600 hours in the U-2 and the SR-71. For his role in the highly classified CIA U-2 project at Area 51 and service to the United States, he has also earned his enshrinement into the Nevada Aerospace Hall of Fame. The year 1957 is significant in many ways as the US was going through challenge after challenge to become the world's reigning superpower. The hopes of the American public and government were in for a bigger shock and were set back with the launch of Sputnik 1 by Russia, which set it a whole lot back in the race for global supremacy. This also fired Bissell and scientist James Killian to design a spy plane that could prove them superior in space technology. But was it even possible? Catch us in the next episode as we reveal the secrets behind the nuclear accident in Area 51. Last episode, we explored the crumbling tensions between the US and Russia during the Cold War and the role Area 51 played in the arms race between the two superpowers. Now let's understand how the strong arm of the US would also become its Achilles heel. We'll see how the base turned into a nuclear test site and also suffered damage during a nuclear accident. It was Robert Mitchell's understanding that by secluding a top-secret nuclear test site within Area 51, the Americans could have complete secrecy in conducting tests to gain an edge over the Russians while also keeping the news from leaking into the public domain. Under the 1957 Operation Plum Bob, codenamed Project 57, the mission was to conduct 29 explosions, of which only 2 would not have nuclear yield. A massive nationwide exercise, it comprised 21 laboratories and government agencies. While most of the tests contributed to the development of warheads for intercontinental and intermediate range missiles, they also tested air defense and anti submarine warheads with smaller yields. One of the tests to be conducted was with the XV-25 nuclear warhead, which was to be exploded to assess radiation levels and its physical effects on tissues and different surfaces. Known as the Dirty Bomb, on March 1957, the warhead was transported from New Mexico to its test site in Nevada, codenamed Area 13. The Pacific was the preferred location to test weaponry given its privacy and seclusion, but the bigger challenge was the transportation of human resources and the equipment needed to establish a test lab. Given the much shorter 2-hour commute to the Nevada test base, it was logged as the final base for the project. 2 weeks before the tests, Nobel laureate Linus Pauling warned that the tests in Nevada would affect 1% of its child population with serious birth defects. Dr. C.W. Schilling, Deputy Director of the Medicine and Biology Department, seconded Pauling and further stated that the region would be seriously damaged for at least the next 5 years, rendering it inhospitable. Under the arms race fever that had caught frenetic pace among the American public, there were no takers for these warnings, and even news reports discredited the experts, citing that children on Marshall Island, where a majority of the American nuclear tests were conducted, were absolutely normal. However, the biggest opposition came from Europe after 100 Japanese students in Tokyo protested outside the US Embassy. Even the then Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, appealed to Eisenhower and warned him about the potentially disastrous consequences of blasts that could affect the entire world. By then, the US was locked in an arms race with Russia, which was seen as the biggest threat to its sovereignty, and hence wanted to pioneer the technology to surpass its Eastern counterpart. They positioned the tests as a security measure to assess how the soldiers could defend themselves against an unprovoked nuclear attack by the enemy. After presidential approval, the mission was officially announced in a press release, where it was disclosed that the US would conduct 24 nuclear tests with low yields. The rest 6 were termed safety drills. This was risky business. The blasts cleared the tree line in and around the base for good and released radioline into the atmosphere, exposing about 3,000 servicemen to high radiation levels. Richard Bissell and his team hadn't anticipated the damage. The cache of U-2 planes was immediately transported off the base and the fire was doused. For the next 13 days, the region in and around Area 51 was reduced to a ghost town, after which it was declared uninhabitable. It was only 3 years later that Bissell, Kelly Johnson, and Edward Lowick, a radio scientists, were permitted to visit and resume work at the base. Kelly Johnson wanted to contribute more to aircraft design and advanced capabilities to counter enemy tactical superiority. He, together with Lowick, recognized the Russians could trace U-2s because of their lack of anti-radar systems on board, and their design did not offer flexibility. Thus began the program to develop surveillance aircraft far superior to the U-2 generation of planes that could easily undertake espionage missions while also outspacing the Russian aircraft. Bissell returned to Area 51 and began to work on the radar test pole, leading a team of 50 scientists and engineers, the result of which was an advanced prototype of the Lockheed A-12. Bissell briefed on the many highlights of the aircraft, like how on the Russian radar it would look like nothing more than a bird. In the race for arms and technological superiority, the Russians spent most of their defense budgets on speed. At the same time, the US's main focus was tactical surveillance capabilities, towards which a considerable chunk had been allotted after Eisenhower approved the funding for the program. One's strength can also turn into an Achilles' heel, and in this case, science would prove to be a double-edged sword for two reigning global superpowers. Stay tuned to find out how in the next episode. The inclusion of the American U-2 spy plane and the Soviet SA-2 into the arms race triggered a deadly cat and mouse between the two, where each could indulge in deep espionage and surveillance on the other in a bid to have the edge over the other. In this episode, we will look at the consequences of this contest, who won and who lost. The CIA had planned to send spy planes to two Soviet sites. One of them, the Turatum Cosmodrome, was the world's first cosmodrome established in 1955. From here, Sputnik was successfully launched into space, which suddenly gave Russia superior space dominance. The second was the Plesetsk site, which was set up originally as an ICBM site for the R-7 missile. Between the two, the Plesetsk site posed a serious security threat to Americans given its proximity to the state of Alaska. On the 1st of May 1960, Francis Gary Powers, a celebrated CIA pilot with 27 successful sorties to his credit, took flight on the U-2 and headed east, quickly achieving the desired altitude. With an overcast sky, any surveillance was rendered fruitless, and it was then decided to fly the plane under the clouds for better photographic coverage of the targets. Powers activated the autopilot system and began to take notes. After a 13-hour flight, he was cruising over Afghanistan and headed towards Russia, which had already tackled the approach of the spy plane. Soviet Defense Minister Marshal Malinowski informed President Khrushchev about the developing threat, who, enraged by the audacity of the Americans, ordered the plane to be traced and shot down at any cost. In his memoirs, in Operation Overflight, published in 1970, Powers mentioned that the situation was fearsome as his spy plane was being given chase by a Soviet MiG while another aircraft was parallelly tracing its movements. As an evasive maneuver, Powers took a 90-degree turn at Sverdlovsk and turned the onboard camera on. He had no idea that he had just captured Kishtum 40, a major Soviet weapons development base. A counter-attack was engaged from the base against the Powers spy plane. A heat-seeking missile was shot at Powers, which hit its target, throwing his plane into a violent spin midair. In this horrific scenario, it was Powers' training that came in handy. He knew that ejecting the seat could incapacitate him physically, but he was ultimately able to successfully deploy his parachute and exit the plane, which crashed immediately. Soviet Colonel Alexander Orlov got the message from Siberia that the American plane had crashed. Meanwhile, Powers had been separated from his destroyed plane and had taken a tough landing which didn't kill him. Back in the US, the National Security Agency informed the President's office that the U-2 has crashed and the pilot had been killed in action. A deadly game of cat and mouse had unfolded over the Soviet skies, with the Russians claiming to have thwarted an American offensive. At the same time, the Americans stuck to plausible deniability and discredited Soviet claims as baseless, citing that what crashed was instead a weather research program module. Khrushchev was smart to avoid reacting publicly to the incident, as it could trigger a Third World War. On the other hand, President Eisenhower too wasn't ready to accept the mission as a failure and stuck to the script at press debriefing. The world was shocked 2 days later when Khrushchev disclosed that they had shot the American spy plane down and apprehended Powers alive. This was the first time when the US had to admit to undertaking spy missions on its counterparts. Powers was brought to Moscow, where he was interrogated at the Lubyanka prison by the KGB. Powers, on the other hand, had already decided to play along, but only to comfort the Soviets into thinking that he was cooperating. In his memoirs, Powers recalls that the Soviet Secret Service repeatedly questioned him about Area 51 and its purpose, responding to which Powers told them that he had instead been trained at the West Coast base in Watertown. Powers was imprisoned for 10 years for spying and illegal espionage. Following the Sverdlovsk dogfight, the CIA had fastened the assembly of the Oxcart planes which countermeasure programs under the code name Project Palladium. The Americans had known about Soviet air defense radar power but also needed to improve their proficiency. The CIA then devised an electronic system to carefully calibrate false targets into the radar units in a bid to deceive the Russians into seeing and tracking a ghost aircraft. The real trick was to find some way of discovering which blips the Soviets could see on their radars. Every Palladium operation consisted of a CIA team with its ghost aircraft system, an NSA team to monitor the communication links, and military operations support team. Covert Palladium operations were carried out against a variety of Soviet radar sites around the world, from ground bases, naval ships, and submarines, with submarine antenna installations being the trickiest. Meanwhile, in 1961, Khrushchev was informed that America intended to attack Cuban airspace as part of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Bissell was now a deputy director of the CIA and had studied the photographic evidence brought back from surveillance of the region. However, since underwater photography was not an advanced technology available on board the U-2, it was impossible to gain an assessment of the coral reefs. This setback would prove to be the main factor behind the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Stay tuned, because in the next episode, we will be bringing you the history behind the famed Manhattan Project and its contribution towards the development of Area 51. In this episode, let's understand how the famed Manhattan Project came into being, along with its connection to Area 51, where Jim Friedman played a key role. Also coming up in this episode is how the use of thermonuclear weapons came into existence. With the turn of the decade, Area 51 came under the leadership of Jim Friedman, who was previously the project leader on the Oxcart reconnaissance missions and was charged with setting the mission protocols and guidelines for the base. He had also previously recruited many skilled scientists and engineers who all held him in high regard. Friedman was the top man at Area 51, catering to the needs and priorities of mission and manpower alike. President Kennedy sent CIA Inspector General Lyman Kirkpatrick to Area 51 to write a report on the base. More specifically, he wanted to assess mission security and what other ritual Bissell disasters might be coming down the pipeline. Much like Bissell, he was cut down in his prime, his loss coming out not of his own actions but by a tragic blow beyond his control. On an agency mission to Asia in 1952, he contracted polio and became paralyzed from the waist down. Confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, Kirkpatrick was relegated to the role of a second-tier bureaucrat. In a world of gentlemen's spycraft and technology espionage, bureaucracy was considered glorified janitorial work. But when Kirkpatrick was dispatched to Area 51 by JFK, the fate and future of the secret base Bissell had built in the Nevada desert lay in Kirkpatrick's hand. In a report to the CIA, he detailed the base's security flaws. This led to the further development of the base in order to secure it more from the world, specifically Soviet surveillance. After the Bay of Pigs invasion ended in disaster for the US, the CIA knew that the base would be the next target for the Russians. Kirkpatrick further added that nothing seemed organized on the base, leading to Bissell's resignation. It was after his exit that, with approval from JFK, that science advisor J. Killian was authorized to develop research on two thermonuclear weapons named Saigon and Orange, as he felt that America would need supreme offensive capabilities in the next war with the Soviets. The blast from the first thermonuclear test resulted in a thick layer of dark, noxious clouds. The shock wave was so intense that it permanently annihilated certain species of fish and ecosystems. After the test, important questions were raised about the justification of owning such powerful weaponry and its effects on the environment. Research proved that the toxic smoke and radiation from the massive explosions shot up in the Earth's atmosphere would forever destroy the protective ozone layer. But such criticism was nothing when faced with a nuclear threat from the Russians, and so in 1993, Kilian continued to expand his tests under Operation Argus. The mission was a series of United States low-yield, high-altitude nuclear weapons tests and missile tests conducted between August and September 1958 by the Defense Nuclear Agency. The project was an attempt at successfully studying the Christofilos effect, which suggested it was possible to defend against Soviet nuclear missiles by exploding a small number of nuclear bombs over the South Pacific. This would create a disk of electrons over the United States that would fry the electronics of the Soviet warheads as they descended. The tests demonstrated that the effect did indeed occur, but dissipated too rapidly to be very effective. Papers on the topic were published the next year, focusing on the events as purely scientific endeavors. On the other hand, Russia in 1960 tested the first hydrogen bomb, which was 450 times more devastating than the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The game is catching pace, dear listeners. So, stay tuned because in the next episode, we'll know how successful the Oxcart planes developed at Area 51 really were. The need for global arms supremacy was beginning to affect the American public. Rumors had begun to be floated around claiming that Area 51 had been working on some sort of extraterrestrial reverse engineering to tackle questions posed to the American Air Force and the CIA. A new department called the UFOlogy Department was created. It was responsible for reporting any extraterrestrial sighting which the CIA would discredit. This was a way to bypass any controversy around the U2 for it to be developed and researched freely. By 1960, reports of UFO sightings had doubled, and the Oxcart too had been spotted by numerous people in the region in and around Lake Groom, which was mistaken for being an alien aircraft given its metallic wings and a high flight ceiling. After development and production at the Skunk Works in Burbank, California, the first A-12 was transferred to the Groom Lake Test Facility, Area 51. On the 25th of April 1962, it was taken on its first flight with Lockheed test pilot Louis Shocks at the controls. The first official flight took place on the 30th of April and the subsequent supersonic flight on the 4th of May 1962, reaching speeds of Mach 1.1 at 40,000 feet or 12,000 miles. Throughout the test flights, fellow test pilot Joe Walker had taken some photographs which were reported as being of small-sized UFO without being fully researched. Given its supersonic speed and testing conducted after dusk, the Oxcart became the center for people's fascination and intrigue, so much so that Congress came under pressure to question the federal government on whether they had been keeping information about experimenting with alien technology from the public. In the decade of the 60s, the mystery surrounding the supposed UFOs gripped the American public, who were already reeling under the uncertainty of the building tensions of the Cold War. They feared that their government had been keeping secrets from them. In a bid to douse any such doubts, the CIA clarified that the metallic objects were not extraterrestrial aircraft visiting Earth, but rather experimental aircraft that were part of psychological warfare. Stay tuned, dear listeners, because in the next episode, we will cover some other fascinating myths and facts surrounding the CIA's supposed UFO. In this episode, we will revisit the tugs of the political war between the US Air Force and the CIA. The first 5 A-12s in 1962 were initially flown with attained speeds 3 times the speed of sound and the capabilities to travel beyond 3,000 miles without needing refueling. However, in 1963, the program also experienced its first loss when on the 24th of May, Article 123 piloted by Kenneth S. Collins crashed near Vandover, Utah. Safely ejecting wearing a standard flight suit, Collins was picked up by a passing truck driver and later called the Highway Patrol Office. The CIA, illustrating the importance of the project, was quick to report it as a public F-105 Thunder Chief in the news and official records. Two local farmers, witnesses to the incident, were told that the aircraft was carrying atomic weapons and a passing family was warned to keep quiet about the crash. Each has also paid $25,000 in cash to comply. After 3 years of the trials and errors, with the team losing more AM-12s in the testing phases, Kelly Johnson shared with Richard Bissell that the ox cart was now ready for operations, who then conducted a successful exhibition of the aircraft in Washington, where pilot Shock achieved an altitude of 30,000 feet with ease while traveling at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. This proved to be the farewell ceremony for Richard Bissell, who otherwise had led the CIA through a relatively more controversial tenure. He was followed by Bud Whelan, who began working at the CIA in 1962. He was responsible for the agency's high-altitude U-2 reconnaissance operations, including flights during the Cuban Missile Crisis after he discovered that the Soviet Union had installed nuclear missile launch pads in Cuba, which was located just 110 miles from the American mainland. What he lacked, though, was clarity and substantial proof to back the reports. Following increasing reports from the general public and the intelligence agencies on heavy military movement, Whelan deduced that suspicious activity and construction were being undertaken on Cuban soil against the people's will. He further suspected that the military trucks and carriers could have warheads deployed towards the west of Cuba for further installation. CIA Director John McCone suspected the same, and Whelan discussed this situation with the National Defense Council, who confirmed foul play from the Russians after carefully assessing the findings. What was more shocking was the Soviet audacity to have discreetly mounted missile pads in America's backyard. The 1963 Cuban Missile Crisis was the zenith of the US-Soviet conflict, which had been simmering for decades. With the situation mutating into a threat to US sovereignty, American services like the CIA and the Air Force buried the hatchet. They worked together to thwart a potential Third World War and nuclear holocaust. Like the Cold War, the crisis of 1963 too was connected to Area 51. It was a U-2 plane that had been spotted flying over Cuba. It had successfully gathered photographic evidence of the Soviet surface-to-air missile sites and traced a MiG-21 at the nearby Santa Clara airfield. Further secret research and surveillance from Area 51 showed that about 6,000 Russian personnel had been transported to Cuba in 3 months, of which 1,700 were military technicians. The president's top advisors were informed of the threatening situation, while the U-2 sent back reports of 19 installed nuclear missile launch pads with evidence. Meanwhile, Air Force Chief of Staff Lee May was pressuring the Cuban government with political sanctions, which could boil the tensions over and unleash nuclear war upon the Western Hemisphere. The agency needed someone who possessed diplomatic mastery to cool the conflict down. Brigadier General Jack Latford was chosen for the purpose. He replanned the strategy by passing what he termed the do nothing worry more moral of the agency, and was responsible for assessing the combat readiness of the forces, and also took the request to the special group to get authorization for the 14th of October 1962 flight over Cuba, which brought back video evidence in the footage proving Soviet presence in Cuba and the installation of missile launch pads. He was instrumental in pushing the need for the ox cart to conduct covert espionage operations that prioritize its role in the execution of tactical war strategies. It had been a year since Bissell's exit when the Air Force pressed the need for similar projects as the ox cart, the result of which was the new line of the YF-12A reconnaissance craft, which could carry and deploy nuclear payloads weighing 250 kilograms and more. It was decided that the CIA would now completely take over covert development and execution of technology, while the Air Force would focus on tactical strategies field missions. This built a cohesive interrelation between the agencies thanks to the efforts of Ledford. It was Area 51 again, which became the center for a strategic and tactical American decision making. All reports were directly shared with the president, but before launching the YF-12A project, an unexpected turn of events threw a spanner in the works. The assassination of President Kennedy on the 22nd of November 1963 plunged America into a state of melancholy. With no potential progress for weeks, had the project been aborted? I'm sure you have found the story of Area 51 just as fascinating as I did. Stay tuned because in the next episode, we will understand what new technologies were incorporated into the advanced version of the strategically important Oxcart craft. I'm sure that just like me, the life of a secret agent or anyone who works for a secret service has fascinated you. But we have also heard stories of agents going through great difficulties and leading a life of peril, always walking on eggshells. Such was the case with the U-2 spy plane project, especially the pilot after the crash. In those days, when the unnamed flight hadn't been achieved, the pilot faced the gravest dangers of either going down with his crashed plane or being arrested on espionage charges. That is why they underwent the most strenuous training drills to face any kind of pressure tactics during missions on interrogation. In the late 1950s, the United States initiated a top-secret reconnaissance program to spy on China's nuclear bomb project. The Central Intelligence Agency trained Chinese pilots who were well versed in the topography of the regions to fly the Lockheed U-2 aircraft. Ye Changti, a 35th Black Cat U-2 squadron pilot, was chosen for the mission and joined the Black Cat squadron in 1963. On the 1st of November 1963, Ye flew on his third mission to spy on Chinese missile production facilities at the Jiuquan missile base in Gansu, northwest China. When he flew over Shangrao on the return leg, his plane was shot down by a surface-to-air missile. He ejected from the plane, whose right wing was torn off. Although hit by 59 missile fragments, he retained enough consciousness to open his parachute before passing out. Upon landing, he was apprehended and reportedly tortured, though he later clarified that he was treated humanely by the Chinese intelligence agencies. After another pilot went through a similar experience, Area 51 commander Slater shared the pilot's disinterest in flying such sorties with powers as the U-2 had repeatedly been shot down in enemy territory. These developments led to the creation of a think tank that began to work on the development of unnamed reconnaissance aircraft, which would greatly reduce human risk while ensuring complete mission secrecy. This now became the top priority for US national security. Introducing drones meant reducing risks on three fronts. This was known as the dull-dirty, dangerous strategy, under which dull meant that the need for a pilot who would be physically and mentally exhausted during long flights to man the craft would be cut out. Dirty meant that the craft could be installed with nuclear warheads, which could then be deployed remotely. And dangerous meant that in the case of a crash, the absence of a pilot meant no threat to his life or leaking information. The contract to produce UAVs or crewless aerial vehicles was given to Lockheed in 1962. Area 51 once again facilitated the testing for UAVs under Operation Tagboat in 1962, where the development of the operational Lockheed T-21 was completed. This was the world's first Mach 3 stealth drone that could be launched from the M21 aircraft and was thus named the M21 Lockheed A-12. It could travel at the supersonic speed of 3,600 km per hour and a ceiling of 90,000 feet. To bring the risks of flying the A-12, which was specifically designed to surveil China, further tests were conducted to master recovery strategies through which, after having gathered photographic and videographic evidence, the drone would dive into the ocean after deploying them via parachute. A standby aircraft would gather the evidence. Colonel Slater himself led the project. During its test launch, a major accident unfolded when the M21 carrying the drone exploded and split in two, killing the pilot. Following this, Kelly Johnson decided to scrap the program to avoid further human loss, but faced opposition from the Air Force, who was not ready to abort the yet to be fully realized mission. It was decided to launch the A-12 from a Boeing B-52, a long-range strategic bomber, with the ability to carry weapons payloads exceeding 32,000 kilograms. 3 years later, the D-21 drone took an official flight to China, upon reaching where it ran out of fuel and crashed. On the 4th of October 1957, Russia shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first unnamed spacecraft, into orbit, changing the game forever. The launch of Sputnik 1 surprised the American public. It shattered the perception created by American propaganda of the United States as the technological superpower and the Soviet Union as a backward country. Privately, however, the CIA and President Eisenhower, who were aware of progress being made by the Soviets on Sputnik from secret spy plane imagery, shared that the 180 LB craft was hardly a cause for worry. But Lyndon B. Johnson, in a bid to leverage political propaganda, was quick to comment that with the newfound technology to man probed successfully in orbit, Russia could attack America at a moment's notice. The public, however, had their theories. About 4% of the population reported spotting Sputnik in the skies while sharing their fears of a future war over American soil. Historian Matthew Brzezinski recounts that most people who spotted the Sputnik had also seen its carrier, the R-7 rocket. Lyndon asked Eisenhower to present a report and to make the news that the Russians had beaten the Americans in the space race public. These developments and events, public paranoia, and added pressure on the American government triggered the war in North Vietnam. After Kennedy's death, Johnson met CIA Director McCone. The latter was briefed on Area 51 and its operations, including the Towhee aircraft project, whose features, specifically its velocity, impressed the president. The Russians had been, until then, ahead here as well, with their aircraft that had broken their speed record at 1,665 miles per hour. Johnson wanted to use the Towhee aircraft to declare that Area 51 had been instrumental in breaking Russian records on multiple fronts. This would mean disclosing covert information to the public and exposing the world's most expensive UAV could put the agency's efforts to keep the advanced technology a secret at huge risk. McCone told Johnson about the craft's maneuvering capabilities, evasive features, and ability to cover huge distances, along with the need to have it secured from public attention. But the president's closest advisors all agreed that the official disclosure of the spy craft would help get an edge over Russia. After Kennedy's death, a secret proposal was made to align the CIA and the Air Force, thus cutting out the risk of losing aircraft in crashes. On the other hand, Kennedy wanted the CIA to operate independently and thus rejected it. It seemed like Johnson would have to convince the others through more dialogue. McCone once again discussed the project with Johnson and told him that half the budget allocated for the development of the aircraft had already been invested and that it would be a bad idea to publicly announce the details, which could pose an immediate threat to national security. Johnson finally agreed, but also decided to disclose the attack version of the craft to the public, which would be called the A-11. 3 months later, on the 29th of February 1964, Johnson announced in a press briefing that the A-11 had decisively broken the airspeed record of the Russians on multiple occasions. From Area 51, 2 YYF-12 craft were deployed to the Edward Air Base in California. During the flight, the titanium surface of the craft had heated up so much that it had to be cooled using coal sprinkles. The risk was overlooked, as the main concern was the A-11's Mach 3 speed. Johnson wanted to know why Oxcart could not be used instead of satellites, which posed less threat and reduced risks. Macron told him that since it takes 90 minutes to orbit the Earth, a satellite can photograph the same place once with every orbit. In contrast, the ox cart could be controlled manually to fly to the same location multiple times to achieve the desired results. He also pressed the ox cart's main features of being a top-level spy plane installed with the most advanced technologies and equipment while also being capable of evading the Soviets. After Khrushchev declared that any spy aircraft traced over Cuba would be shot down, the CIA found the perfect chance to deploy the ox cart. But it wasn't ready yet. Kenneth Collins began the preparations for the ox cart test flights, where developments were made on the hydraulics navigation system and flight controls. The biggest challenge, however, was that occasionally the engine was prone to shutting down mid-air and the other engine would overheat. Because of this, the risk of a crash was inevitable. Another challenge came from the Air Force, which observed that the ox cart could not fly at lower altitudes. In 1964, the US began testing nuclear bombs underground. A year before, both America and Russia had signed a limited test ban treaty where they would not use air, offshore sites, or the sea to conduct experiments. With the rampant distrust between the two nations, both nations, however, conducted underground tests, with the US doing so at Area 51. The show of power would soon thrust both into the abyss of the Cold War. Area 51 also facilitated the development of America's first radar jamming system. Codenamed Red Dog, later changed to Blue Dog, the system was developed under Ken Swanson, who served as the ICM officer at the base. The tactical system was installed on the ox cart, which enabled it to detect Soviet surface-to-air missiles and deploy electric impulses that would jam its electronics, rendering it ineffective. This, too, was tested at Area 51 as part of the operational development of the ox cart. Then, grim news reached the Americans that war has broken out in North Vietnam. The 8th U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, suggested that the ox cart could prove effective in such combat situations and thus began the aircraft's preparations for the upcoming missions. The bird will have to leave its nest. These were the words of Lyndon Johnson, who wrote them down in his diary during Mission Black Shield. Welcome again to yet another exciting episode of this series called Area 51. In this episode, we will understand how the ox cart was gearing up for the most challenging mission and rolled into action. The new president of the CIA, Richard Helms, had to work doubly hard to impress Johnson, but ultimately he worked his way up to a launch appointment with the president. Johnson scheduled meetings with his closest advisors once each week, and Tuesdays were reserved for discussions on strategy and planning through the ongoing crisis in Vietnam. In 1957, a proxy war broke out between the US and Russia in Haiphong, resulting in the deaths of many American pilots. Sources claimed that Russia had installed surface-to-air missile bases in northern Vietnam and could target the Americans south of the mainland. This convinced the Americans to deploy the ox cart, which was on the verge of getting cancelled, and use it to gather high-resolution photographic and videographic evidence of missile bases. McNamara wanted to control the mission himself, as he was informed that the SR-71 Blackbird was almost operational. Given the monsoon month of June in Vietnam, Johnson decided to deploy the ox cart in Vietnam from Okinawa Island in Japan as soon as possible. The island had been handed over to the US in the aftermath of Japan's unconditional surrender after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks and was spread over 10% of the landmass. This mission was named Black Shield. Commander Slater pressed the need to focus on mission security. As part of an evasive strategy, he suggested using a decoy by setting up a similar mission elsewhere to divert the attention of the Soviets to use the time to engage timely offensives. Moreover, after the landing of the ox carts in Okinawa, Russian boats were seen in and around the ports nearby. Slater is quoted as saying he knew they were there and watching us while he was watching them too. Pilot Voivodich was ordered to fly over northern Vietnam for the first flight. After spending 9 minutes inside the territory, he sent back a cache of 70 high-resolution photographs that had captured surface-to-air missile launch bases. 15 high-altitude missions were flown between the 1st to the 31st of January 1968, where 6 of the 15 missions were flown, 4 over Vietnam and 2 over North Korea. 8 missions were cancelled due to weather conditions, and approval for one Korean mission was not obtained. Black Shield photography of North Vietnam through March 1968 revealed no evidence of surface ballistic missiles, equipment, or facilities. However, mission BX-6843 photographed two suspected surface-to-surface cruise missile sites near Than Hoa. One site was unoccupied and the second contained a few small unidentified objects. The program provided initial baseline coverage of North Korea on missions and readable coverage of 70% of the country. These missions supplied current photography of North Korean industrial transportation systems and updated the existing order of battle. In Katena, operation officers also attempted to evade Russian spies. But 4 out of these 7 missions were detected, while attempts to shoot down A-12S also failed. It was nearly impossible to spot the superplane because of its high altitude. But the mission was not without its setbacks either. Harvey Stockman, the first to fly to the Soviet Union, was apprehended in 1967 in northern Vietnam and confined to a POW camp where he met many other prisoners like himself. As part of the psychological warfare, the CIA began to dig out old skilled pilots while also interrogating Soviet pilots who would be tortured on camera to gain leverage in the situation as part of a rescue and exchange program. In 1968, the Americans were stunned by an unexpected attack when the Pueblo, a Navy ship heading for North Korea, was captured by Communist forces near Wonsan Harbor. The ship had been on a top-secret mission but was presented as a scientific research base. Photographs taken by the Oxcart revealed that the Pueblo was in North Korean territory and its crew had been tortured and even killed. Johnson was livid with North Korean audacity and called for a secret meeting where he ordered the forces ready to attack the belligerent. It had been just 3 days when the Oxcart located the Pueblo decked at the Changchun port. But an attack on the location was ruled out given the collateral damage. Weeks passed without the North Koreans making a move. Pueblo was a big naval ship that an enemy had captured. Its crew would spend another 11 months in captivity until they were released. In February 1968, 24 Oxcart missions were flown, resulting in the destruction of almost all of Vietnam's surface-to-surface missile sites. McNamara then met with the president to inform him that the war had been finally and decisively won. The success of Mission Blackbird galvanized the need for unmanned UAVs in modern warfare. The Blackbird SR-71 and the Oxcart had proven instrumental in gathering preemptive evidence and offering the U.S. tactical air superiority on the battleground. On the 4th of June, the aircraft was readied for the flight home. The pilots had just reached the base when another grim news came. Bobby Kennedy, like his brother, had been assassinated. When pilot Collins grabbed the day's newspaper, he was shocked to read the headline and marked a high-altitude crash of a U.S. Air Force aircraft. Collins recalled that this was the Oxcart his driver had mentioned was lost. Another sacrifice had been made for a higher cause. Upon the return of the remaining aircraft, a hearty celebration awaited their arrival. An engineer must know the process of creating components that work beautifully and perfectly as a unit. Being a reverse engineer, however, requires one to break down the technology backward to be able to replicate it. Besides secret US aircraft work, engineers at Area 51 also studied the secretly acquired Soviet MiG fighters. But how did the Americans acquire an enemy plane? Did you know that the first was delivered to the US by Israel? MiG-21. Israel had acquired the plane in August 1966 following the defection of a captain of the Iraqi Air Force and landed the MiG at an airbase in northern Israel. From the 23rd of January 1986 to the 8th of April 1968, the plane was loaned to the US Air Force. During the 1966 Six-Day War in the Middle East, an Iraqi Air Force pilot named Munir Redfa was engaged in a dogfight by the Israeli counter-strike. When to evade his pursuers, Redfa performed evasive maneuvers by flying in a zigzag fashion, confirming that he was making a run for his life. However, he had been chased into Israeli territory and was forced to make a forced landing. He was surprised when instead of being apprehended, $1 million waited in his bank account. The plane was later loaned to the US. It had been the masterstroke of the Mossad, Israel's secret service, to steal a MiG after multiple attempts at having Redfa defect to Israel, which included luring him with a luxurious and comfortable life on a beachside penthouse, and also a beautiful female spy who, after pretending to fall in love with him, made her shocking disclosure. It was reported that all the nations it was engaged in war with were flying MiGs in their air force. Thus, the plan 4 years in the making helped not just Israel, but even the Americans in understanding the enemy's air combat capabilities. The MiG, now in the US Air Force's temporary possession, was named the YF-110, and Area 51 became its new home. The reverse engineering was conducted under the code name Have Donut, which focused on the technical and tactical evaluation of the plane. The efforts were to achieve 4 primary objects. Number 1. Assessing the effectiveness of existing technical maneuvers. Number 2. Understanding capabilities and limitations in air-to-air combat. Number 3. Optimizing existing tactics and developing new ones to defeat the MiG-21. Number 4. A study of the design, performance and characteristics of the MiG-21. While the Have Donut and Have Drill or Have Ferry efforts are the ones whose details have been declassified, they were not the last MiG exploitation efforts at Area 51. Under a program designated Constant Peg, the Air Force tested other MiGs acquired by a variety of means to determine their capabilities and vulnerabilities. In the 1970s, the effort moved to Tonopah Test Range, about 70 miles northwest of Area 51. After returning to Washington, James Angleton shared the Redfa episode with Richard Helms. The two had known each other for 25 years, and with his covert operations, Angleton impressed the American president a great deal. The Redfa story had captured headlines, but what happened after the incident was kept a secret from the public eye. Unbeknown to most, the MiG was comfortably stationed at Area 51. It was the MiG that brought down many American planes during the Vietnam War. Now, with full access to its design and components, T.D. Barnes, along with the EG&G Special Project Group, was charged with reverse engineering Russian advanced air technology. In simpler terms, it was their job to dismantle the plane and put it back together again, not to mention successfully fly it. Close to 102 mock drills were conducted over Groom Lake to comprehensively understand the aircraft, after which all of MiG's technical, electrical, and hydraulic operations were successfully studied. In the meantime, the Soviets weren't too keen on sitting idle either. They got word of the presence of the MiG at Area 51. They also discovered details on the Oxcart and its capabilities. America would later develop and produce advanced fighter jets that gave them unprecedented and superiority in the Middle East. One of the biggest tests was conducted at the region designated Area 13, which was located 5 miles from Lake Groom within Area 51. The blast was so dangerous that the region was deemed inhospitable after a year of radioactive contamination, and the area was redesignated as a dangerous zone. All work in the area was banned immediately. On the 17th of January 1996, an incident occurred when a B-52G bomber of the United States Air Force's Strategic Air Command collided with the KC-135 tanker during mid-air refueling at 31,000 feet or 9,450 miles over the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Spain. The KC-135 was destroyed when its fuel load ignited, killing all 4 crew members. The B-52G broke apart, killing 3 of the 7 crew members aboard. At the time of the accident, the B-52G was carrying 4 thermonuclear hydrogen bombs, all of which fell to the surface. 3 were found on land near the small fishing village of Palomares. The non-nuclear explosives in 2 weapons detonated upon impact with the ground, contaminating a 0.77 square miles or 2-kilometer area with radioactive plutonium. Thankfully, none of the civilians were reported to have been affected, as at the time everyone was at church. A team of 800 personnel were deployed to search for the missing weapon, including employees from the Los Alamos Laboratory, the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory, Sandia Laboratories, Raytheon, and EG&G Company, all of which had together produced the weapons themselves. Back in time, on the 21st of January 1968, an explosion of a dirty bomb was reported after a B-52 bomber caught fire. The crew was pulled out of the burning debris somehow. But as the plane had been stationed near the Thule Air Base, the explosion spread radioactive material throughout the region that included uranium and plutonium. After this incident, there was a spike in cleanup measures which began to be explored as a lucrative business, but detecting radiation and its measurement became imperative to undertake the efforts successfully. Detecting sensors and machines had begun to be used before the Palomares and Greenland accidents. Still, instruments like Geiger counters and handheld trackers came into existence when the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory developed the Sky Scanner, which detects radioactive levels. Necessity again bore invention and ushered in a thriving market of such off-the-shelf products in the 21st century. Remote sensing is detecting and monitoring an area's physical characteristics by measuring its reflected and emitted radiation at a distance via satellite or aircraft. EG&G emerged as a special radiation detector market, followed by its sister company located at the Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, which also worked on several other instruments. Coming back to Area 51, did you know that there is a replica of the base just a stone's throw away from it? Just like the original, Area 25 is surrounded by mountains. But the major difference between the two was that while Area 51 was used as a base for top-secret weapons and technology research, Area 25 served the American space travel program. The base was slowly assimilated to serve the nuclear-based spaceship development when German aero engineer and space architect Werner von Braun successfully developed a chemical-based rocket that could take a man to the moon. At the beginning of Project Orion at Area 25, development began on producing a spacecraft that could have the power of 2,000 small nuclear bombs, but after the ban on atmospheric nuclear tests, the project was installed. The NERVA project, or Nuclear Engine Rocket Vehicle Application, followed this up. This was a huge mission where NASA and the Atomic Energy Commission came together to develop the super advanced rocket. The data on the last test of the mission was classified and not shared with the public, and this, too like Orion, was aborted. Recently, on the 25th of January 2005, a survey conducted by the Nevada Environmental Restoration Project, the Nuclear Security Administration reported that Area 25 still had potent traces of radioactive elements that could pose a threat to human life. Hello dear friends, welcome back to this amazing series called Area 51. Being the center for controversy for close to 6 decades now, there are bound to be rumors surrounding this top secret base. The geopolitical rivalry between the Americans and the Soviets fired the fears and imaginations of millions of people across the globe. While most anticipated a Third World War, on the 4th of October 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. This suddenly put the Soviets ahead in the arms race. It was now proven that they could deliver nuclear weapons over intercontinental distances, thus posing questions about American claims of military, economic, and technological superiority. This precipitated a space crisis and an urgency to prove which superpower would achieve superior spaceflight capability. Following this, President Eisenhower responded to the Sputnik challenge by creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, and approved Project Mercury, which aimed to launch a man into Earth orbit. On the 16th of July 1969, the Apollo mission was launched, the first lunar mission to land a man on its surface. Riding the Eagle lunar module, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon on the 20th of July 1969. Some 650 million people across the globe watched the telecast live at home. But no sooner had the celebrations begun, along came rumors from ufologists that the moon was an alien base, but NASA was quick to discredit these claims. As the space race captured people's fascinations, fears, and interests, questions began to be asked about the mission's authenticity and the secrecy with which NASA and the American government undertook them. Given the suspense, mystery, and fear surrounding the topic, UFOs and aliens became a part of pop culture, with movie directors wanting to produce films that told stories about them and their unseen worlds, thus adding fuel to the fire. An interesting anecdote from 1975 goes like this. Steven Spielberg, the legendary Hollywood director and producer, was one of the first to cash in on the science fiction wave of the 1970s and wanted to produce a film on extraterrestrial visitors. He contacted NASA seeking their guidance on a script he had written and shared it with the team. After a long wait, NASA responded to his request by citing that the story would lead to mass hysteria and create a fear psychosis. Just as was the case with his previous blockbuster, Jaws, which had horrified audiences so much that it had cleared people off the beach fronts across America as they had developed a terror for man-eating sharks. Following the Vietnam War that resulted in the deaths of 58,103 American soldiers, the public was disillusioned with the dream that was promised, with even the moon landings gathering much more controversy than authenticity. It was the first time in the history of the nation that the president resigned given immense pressure. A 6-page article published in the New York Sun reported that life and civilization had both been discovered on the moon. The article spoke of winged humans and unicorns. This boosted the sales of the newspaper, with people thronging the stands to get their copy. But it was eventually discovered that the article was just a sales ruse that worked to benefit none but the publishers. To add the criticism, Alan Poe in his article was also quick to underplay the impact of the achievement, citing that it hadn't exactly done wonders to the American morale. A news spread about the moon conspiracy. A book by William Kaysing titled We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion swindle was published, and it raised some serious doubts about the mission, such as if there was no air on the moon, how was it that the American flag was seen furling on its surface? Or, for that matter, why are there no stars on the horizon beyond the moon? Another question posed was, why was there no blast or takeoff impact on the moon's surface? Furthermore, in a 2000 interview, he claimed that the moon landing had actually been staged on a set created at Area 51. Surprisingly, he had a lot of support from people who also claimed that the entire mission was fraud. Following these events, in 2002, NASA asked historian Jim Corbett to author a book to counter claims of fraud, but the book was never published. Apart from these controversies, two more are usually floated around in Area 51. Firstly, there are aliens in captivity on the base. And secondly, that the long tunnel that supposedly is part of an interconnected web joins the various American military facilities and nuclear laboratories. Author Michelle Schratt has repeatedly mentioned in her lectures that Area 51 is, in fact, a conduit between the North Base Complex and Air Force Plant 42, which are connected by an underground tube tunnel system, which the RAND Corporation developed in 1960. Apart from this, it is also mentioned that the site is also connected to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. The tube tunnel system is perceived as a security measure which can shelter key government officials like the President and his Joint Chiefs of Staff in case of a nuclear war. In truth, these claims are actually supported by a tunnel system that did exist on the base. This system facilitated the transportation of the working staff to the underground workstations, while also allowing the ease of movement of heavy equipment for conducting the on-site nuclear tests. Richard Mingus, who lived on the base for many years, had also worked on the nuclear tests and used the system to commute between departments. Of the underground bunkers at Area 51, Grenier is a top-secret facility that was conducted within Allegheny Mountain in 1962, made especially to shelter the president and his key advisors in case of a nuclear war. It had dormitories, a huge mess hall, and medical facilities with a team of 25 doctors ready to tackle emergencies. Area 51 was also an employment generator for people from various skills and fields like carpenters, welders, electricians, doctors, architects, plumbers, and many others. While all of them worked on the base, they were sworn to secrecy and were not allowed to share details of their work with another employee or, in many cases, even their family members. Before the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty, it was a common practice by the Pentagon to announce the tests to the public 2 hours before they were conducted. But after the treaty, the policy was changed and information sharing now depended on the scale of the test. Between 1963 and 1992, the US conducted about 800 underground test blasts. Other conspiracy theories surrounding Area 51 reared their heads, like housing aliens at the base, an elaborated film set to create a scripted moon landing. In the favor of mission secrecy, the Atomic Energy Commission maintained a neutral stand on these claims, neither accepting nor denying them openly. In August 2010, the Nevada test site was designated Nevada National Security and became a hot favorite among internet conspiracy theorists from around the world. The Center for Suspense and Secrets Galore, the base in 2011, was among the most searched sites on the internet along with topsecret.com. Did you know that 1980, the guard station at Area 51 came under attack? A mock helicopter had entered the secured area and fired missiles and semi-automatic nuclear bombs. The situation was so serious that it alerted the Pentagon and the White House. As part of a drill to train guards to deal with levels of emergent security threats from low-impact aircraft or explosions of higher yield, the guards and the crew at Area 51 were subjected to sudden drills to assess security and preparedness. The FBI was informed of the same, but the incident was never disclosed, just like so many of its experiments, programs, and developments. Part of the reason for the sudden drill at the base was also to ensure the secure running of a top-secret program called the Black Project, a highly classified project that the government did not publicly acknowledge. Examples of U.S. military aircraft developed as Black Projects include the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk stealth attack aircraft and the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, both highly classified and publicly denied until they were ready to be announced to the public. Edward Lowick was the Lockheed physicist charged with the development of the F-117, and after careful assessment, the location designated for the project was Area 52 or the Tonopah Test Range. Located about 70 miles from 51, Tonopah was once the mining ground for gold and silver and was even connected with Las Vegas via rail. The Sandia laboratories had earlier used the site as a bombing range and missile launch facility, where between 1957 to 1966, a total of 680 bombs and 555 rockets were test launched. In 1963, it also served as a site for top-secret plutonium dispersal efforts. Throughout the development of the F-117, the site was hidden from public view and its activities remained undisclosed. The dual efforts of Area 51 and 52 helped develop the aircraft for on-field operations. It was midway when a sudden accident took place on the site. Lieutenant General Bond, who was flying a MiG over Groom Lake, lost control of the aircraft, which crashed over the Jackass Flats, resulting in his death. The Jackass Flats was the same site that had served the testing of the Nerva project, but had also resulted in the contamination of the area. After the veterans' crash, the site came under public scrutiny, with its 5 secret missions risking exposure to the public domain. These included the development of the F-117, covert operations at Area 51, and the nuclear explosion at the Flats. However, contingency plans kept the details from being leaked and the secrets remain undisclosed. In mid-1965, the CIA began work on the vehicle. It would be about the size of a large bird and carry various payloads, including photographic equipment, nuclear sensors, and alien recorders. A special project group was formed, followed by the development of a low-altitude intelligence gathering system. Upon assessing the project, General Henry said that while a nation's air superiority would still decide future wars, they would not need manned aircraft and technology, reducing the human risk involved in flying reconnaissance and offensive missions during the conflict. For close to half a century, unmanned aerial vehicles had been tested regularly but came into the public eye only after 2002, when the assassination of Salim al-Harithi, an al-Qaeda leader in Yemen involved in the USS Cole bombing, was killed by the CIA during a covert targeting killing mission in Yemen on the 3rd of November 2002. The CIA used a Predator drone to shoot the Hellfire missile that killed al-Harithi and 5 other al-Qaeda operatives as they rode in a vehicle 100 miles east of the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. The Predator drone had been tested at Area 51 and 52 bases and was earlier designated RQ. Predator, where R stood for reconnaissance and Q meant that it was unnamed. A second-generation drone was also developed and named the Reaper, with the main difference between the two being the payload weights. Area 51 is a pioneer in advanced surveillance and warfare technology and also worked on ground sensor programs and infrared techniques like the W61 penetrator and the bunker buster. There is no way to tell what happens at Area 51 and its tube tunnel systems. The activities and programs are a closely guarded secret with access only to CIA top officials, the President of the United States, and the federal government. With the ever-clashing tensions and constantly shifting geopolitical scenarios, it is clear that such covert programs will remain locked behind closed doors for decades to come. Places like Area 51, built to keep national treasures and secrets, are bound to raise eyebrows and pique curiosities with their covert activities that seem mysterious and even suspenseful to the common public. The site has been the hotbed for rumors galore and a multitude of conspiracy theories, from housing an alien base to captured extraterrestrial craft and life forms to having secret bunkers and test facilities that are interconnected through a web of underground tubes. All of these only work to increase anxiousness and uncertainty among people when in fact every nation in the world has its own such sites working in the interest of the security of its people. In this amazing series, we have covered how this site was created, its initial purpose as a strong military base that contributed towards the development and defense programs of the United States, undertook stealth missions, and was led by some of the greatest scientific and political minds of the last and current generation. Along with Area 51, Area 13, Area 25 and Area 52 have all contributed towards strengthening the military and scientific might of the country. In a nutshell, Area 51 will forever hold a high priority when it comes to the national security of the United States, from where some of the most game-changing developments, inventions, innovations, and strategies were deployed and implemented and continue to do so for generations to come. Only time will tell what amazing technology and programs are currently on at Area 51.